In the vast expanse of the American West, where mountains carve ancient boundaries and valleys hold secrets older than memory, some communities exist beyond the reach of modern governance. The fictional story of the Collins Valley explores how isolation can breed its own form of justice, how fear can silence entire populations, and how the absence of outside authority can allow dangerous traditions to flourish unchecked. This investigative documentary-style narrative examines the psychological and social forces that can transform ordinary people into silent witnesses, exploring themes of territorial control, inherited power, and the devastating consequences when communities operate by rules that exist nowhere in any legal code. Through the lens of a fictional 1979 case, we delve into the complex dynamics of loyalty, complicity, and survival in America's most remote corners. What follows is a story about boundaries, both the physical ones that separate communities from the outside world and the moral ones that people cross when fear becomes their guiding principle. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The autumn of 1979 brought an unusual chill to the Montana wilderness, but it wasn't just the early frost that made travelers avoid the winding road through Collins Valley. State Trooper Margaret Chen had driven these mountain highways for 7 years, yet she'd never taken the turnoff marked only by a weathered wooden sign reading, Collins Valley Private Road. Like most law enforcement in the region, she'd heard whispers about the isolated community nestled 30 miles into the Bitterroot Range, but official business rarely called anyone that deep into the mountains. That changed on October 15th, when Chen received a call that would launch one of Montana's most perplexing investigations. The voice on the radio belonged to dispatch operator Linda Morrison, whose usually steady tone carried an edge of uncertainty. "Margaret, we've got a situation that doesn't quite fit our usual protocols," Morrison said, her words careful and measured. "Federal authorities are requesting a welfare check on some missing hikers, and the trail leads toward Collins Valley." Chen pulled her patrol car onto the shoulder of Highway 93, the engine idling as she processed the request. Missing hikers weren't uncommon in Montana's vast wilderness, but federal involvement suggested something more serious than a routine search and rescue operation. "How many missing, and for how long?" Chen asked, already knowing this wouldn't be a simple case. "That's where it gets complicated," Morrison replied. "We're looking at 14 separate missing person reports filed across 4 different states over the past 6 months. All were last seen heading into the same general area of the Bitterroot Mountains. 14 people. The number hung in the mountain air like a storm cloud. Chen had worked enough missing person cases to know that such a concentration wasn't coincidence. Something was drawing people to this remote corner of Montana, or something was preventing them from leaving. The Collins Valley had always existed at the margins of official Montana. Settled in 1892 by Jeremiah Collins, a cattle rancher who claimed vast stretches of mountain territory during the land rush era, the valley operated under what locals called the Old Understanding. Jeremiah's descendants maintained that their family's original claim superseded later government surveys, creating a legal gray area that authorities had historically chosen to ignore rather than challenge in court. By 1979, the valley was home to roughly 200 residents, most bearing the Collins name or married into the family. They operated a handful of businesses that served the surrounding ranching community, a general store, a small sawmill, and a trading post that sold supplies to hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. To the outside world, Collins Valley appeared to be nothing more than another isolated Montana community, trying to preserve its way of life against the encroachment of modern civilization. FBI Special Agent David Reeves had been tracking the pattern of disappearances for 3 months before requesting state assistance. His investigation began when Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old environmental scientist from Colorado, failed to return from a solo hiking trip in August. Martinez had been documenting water quality in remote mountain streams as part of a federal environmental impact study, work that required her to travel deep into unmarked wilderness areas. What made Sarah's case stand out wasn't just that she disappeared, Reeves would later explain in his official report. It was that her research equipment was found exactly where she'd left it, as if she'd simply walked away from her work mid-sample. Environmental scientists don't abandon expensive federal equipment without good reason. The discovery of Martinez's abandoned research site led Reeves to examine other missing person reports from the region. What he found was a disturbing pattern that had gone unnoticed because the disappearances were spread across state lines and handled by different agencies. The missing individuals shared few demographic similarities. They ranged in age from 19 to 65, came from various socioeconomic backgrounds, and had different reasons for traveling through Montana. The only common thread was their last known location, the remote mountain region surrounding Collins Valley. Among the missing were Tom and Jennifer Walsh, a young couple from Wisconsin who'd been driving cross-country in a converted van, documenting small-town America for a photography project. Their vehicle was found abandoned on a logging road 15 miles from Collins Valley, personal belongings still inside, no sign of struggle or mechanical failure. There was Dr. Robert Kim, a geology professor from the University of Washington, who'd been conducting mineral surveys in the area as part of a sabbatical research project. His colleagues expected regular check-ins every 3 days. Kim had been silent for over 2 weeks when they contacted authorities. The list included Maria Santos, a freelance journalist researching isolated American communities for a magazine article about off-grid living, and James Patterson, a retired military veteran who'd been hiking the Continental Divide Trail in sections during his summer vacation. Each case, viewed individually, could be explained by the inherent dangers of Montana's wilderness: sudden weather changes, wildlife encounters, accidental falls, or simple disorientation in terrain where GPS signals were unreliable and cell phone coverage non-existent. But 14 disappearances in the same general area within 6 months suggested something more systematic. Reeves's investigation had reached a crucial juncture when he contacted Montana State Police. Federal agents had legal authority to investigate across state lines, but they needed local knowledge and cooperation to navigate Montana's complex web of private property rights, tribal territories, and local jurisdictions. Collins Valley, with its disputed land claims and insular community, represented exactly the kind of legal maze that could stall a federal investigation indefinitely. Trooper Chen understood the delicate nature of her assignment as she finally turned onto the gravel road, leading toward Collins Valley. Her role was officially described as establishing communication and cooperation with local residents, but she knew the real purpose was to determine whether the community was hiding something or simply unaware of the federal investigation. The road into Collins Valley wound through dense forest for nearly an hour before opening into the broad mountain meadow that gave the community its name. Chen's first impression was of a place suspended between centuries. Most of the buildings followed frontier architectural traditions: log construction, steep metal roofs, wide porches designed for harsh weather. Yet modern conveniences were visible: satellite dishes, propane tanks, pickup trucks of recent vintage parked outside homes that might have been built 100 years earlier. The community was arranged around a central common area containing the general store, post office, and what appeared to be a meeting hall. Residential properties spread outward in a pattern that suggested both deliberate planning and organic growth over generations. Most striking was the sense of order and maintenance. This wasn't a struggling backwater community, but a place that took pride in its appearance and traditions. Chen parked outside the general store, noting how conversations stopped and residents paused their activities to observe her arrival. This was normal behavior in small communities where strangers were notable events, but something in the quality of attention felt different. The residents weren't curious about an unfamiliar visitor. They seemed to be evaluating a potential threat. The general store served as the valley's unofficial information center, its bulletin board covered with notices about community events, equipment for sale, and requests for seasonal labor. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, whose steady gaze and confident posture suggested she was accustomed to managing both the store and whatever questions visitors might bring. "Good afternoon," Chen said, approaching the counter with her badge visible but not prominently displayed. "I'm Trooper Chen with Montana State Police. I wonder if I might speak with someone about some missing hikers who may have passed through the area. The woman's expression remained neutral, professional courtesy masking whatever thoughts Chen's presence had triggered. "I'm Ruth Collins," she said. "My family owns most of the valley, and I manage community affairs. What kind of missing hikers are you asking about?" The directness of Ruth's response surprised Chen. In most small communities, residents would deflect official questions or insist on consulting with neighbors before providing information. Ruth Collins spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected an entire community. "We're investigating several disappearances over the past few months," Chen explained. "People who were last seen traveling through this general area of the mountains. I have photographs if you wouldn't mind taking a look." Ruth nodded, her expression unchanging as Chen spread 14 photographs across the store counter. The images showed ordinary people, families, students, professionals, who'd vanished while pursuing routine activities in Montana's backcountry. Chen watched Ruth's face carefully as she examined each photograph, looking for any sign of recognition or concealment. "I don't recognize any of these individuals," Ruth said after examining the photos thoroughly. "We don't get many tourists this deep in the valley. Most people who find their way here are either lost or specifically looking for our trading post." The answer was plausible, even expected. Collins Valley was indeed isolated, and its residents would naturally be suspicious of strangers, asking questions about missing people. Yet something in Ruth's manner suggested she was choosing her words carefully, providing technically accurate information while avoiding broader implications. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few months?" Chen asked. "Abandoned vehicles, camping equipment left behind, anything that might suggest people were in the area but didn't make it out?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "Nothing like that. We keep pretty close track of what happens in our valley, Trooper Chen. If there'd been abandoned vehicles or equipment, someone would have reported it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tall man in his 60s whose bearing and clothing suggested both authority and prosperity. He moved through the store with the confidence of someone who owned not just the building but the ground it stood on, and his presence immediately changed the dynamic of Chen's conversation with Ruth. "This is my husband, Samuel Collins," Ruth said. "Sam, this is Trooper Chen. She's asking about some missing hikers." Samuel Collins extended a weathered hand that spoke of decades of outdoor work, his grip firm but not aggressive. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they studied Chen with the calculating attention of someone accustomed to evaluating potential challenges to his authority. "Federal agents been asking the same questions," Samuel said without preamble. "Seems like there's some confusion about jurisdiction and property rights up here. Hope we can clear that up before it becomes a problem for everyone involved." The implicit warning in Samuel's words was clear. Collins Valley considered itself beyond the reach of outside authority, and any investigation would need to respect local autonomy. Chen had encountered similar attitudes in other isolated communities, but rarely delivered with such confidence and directness. "We're just trying to account for some missing people, Mr. Collins," Chen said. "No one's questioning anyone's property rights. We're hoping your community might have information that could help these families get some answers." Samuel nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting he was weighing multiple considerations before responding. "Trooper Chen, our valley has operated by its own rules for nearly 90 years. We've maintained order, taken care of our own problems, and stayed out of everyone else's business. That's worked pretty well for all involved." The statement carried layers of meaning that Chen was still processing when Samuel continued. "Now, if government agents start questioning our authority in our own territory, that could create problems that go way beyond a few missing tourists. I hope everyone understands the implications of that." As Chen prepared to respond, she noticed that several valley residents had gathered outside the general store, their presence neither threatening nor accidental. They stood in small groups, conducting quiet conversations while maintaining awareness of the official vehicle parked outside their community center. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Collins Valley was prepared to present a united front against outside interference. The investigation had barely begun, but already Chen could see why 14 people might disappear without explanation in a place where traditional authority superseded government jurisdiction. where community loyalty trumped cooperation with outsiders, and where the vast wilderness provided countless opportunities for secrets to remain buried beneath Montana's endless sky. The morning after Trooper Chen's initial visit to Collins Valley, FBI Special Agent David Reeves established a temporary command post at the Bitterroot Ranger Station, 25 miles from the valley's entrance. The facility provided secure communications, detailed topographical maps, and most importantly, a location where federal agents could coordinate their investigation without alerting the Collins community to every movement and decision. Reeves had spent the night reviewing case files and weather reports, searching for patterns that might explain how 14 people could vanish in such a concentrated area without leaving significant traces. The Montana wilderness was unforgiving, but it rarely swallowed people completely. Even fatal accidents typically left evidence, abandoned gear, disturbed vegetation, or remains that searchers could eventually locate. The problem isn't that people disappear in these mountains, Reeves explained to Chen during their first joint briefing. The problem is that these specific disappearances don't follow normal patterns. When experienced hikers get lost or injured, they usually stay put and wait for rescue. When inexperienced people get in trouble, they panic and leave obvious trails. But these 14 cases show neither pattern. Chen spread the missing persons files across the conference table, each folder representing someone's child, parent, or partner who'd simply ceased to exist while traveling through Montana. The diversity of the missing individuals made the pattern even more disturbing. These weren't all inexperienced tourists who'd made poor decisions in dangerous terrain. The group included people with significant outdoor experience, professional researchers, and individuals who'd specifically chosen low-risk activities in well-marked areas. Take Dr. Robert Kim, Chen said, opening the geology professor's file. He'd been conducting mineral surveys in remote locations for 15 years. His colleagues say he was obsessively careful about safety protocols and communication schedules, yet he apparently abandoned a research site where he'd been working for 3 days, leaving expensive equipment behind. The case of Maria Santos, the freelance journalist, presented similar contradictions. Santos had been researching isolated American communities, work that required her to build trust with suspicious residents and navigate complex social dynamics. Her editor at Outside Magazine described her as someone who understood how to approach insular communities without triggering defensive responses. Santos's rental car was found at a trailhead 15 miles from Collins Valley, Reeves noted. Her hiking gear was missing, but her laptop and camera equipment were still in the vehicle. She'd been documenting her research extensively, but the last entry in her notes was dated 3 days before anyone reported her missing. The timeline inconsistencies troubled both investigators. Most of the missing persons had been reported several days after they were actually last seen, creating gaps that complicated any reconstruction of their final movements. Family members and colleagues had assumed the missing individuals were simply out of communication range, a reasonable assumption in Montana's vast wilderness areas where cell phone coverage was sporadic at best. Chen had requested detailed reports from the Flathead County Search and Rescue Team, which had conducted preliminary investigations of several abandoned vehicles and last known locations. The search and rescue coordinator, Mike Torres, had 30 years of experience in Montana backcountry operations, and his assessment of the missing persons cases raised additional questions. Torres told me something interesting, Chen said, consulting her notes from their phone conversation. He said the abandoned vehicles and equipment were found in what he called staging areas, places where people typically prepare for longer hikes or camping trips, not final destinations. It's as if these people were just beginning their activities when something interrupted them. The staging area observations suggested that the missing individuals hadn't been lost or injured during extended wilderness activities. Instead, something had happened early in their visits to the region, before they'd traveled far from road access or established base camps. This pattern pointed toward human intervention rather than natural causes. Reeves had been building a geographical profile of the disappearances, marking last known locations on detailed topographical maps and looking for clusters or pathways that might indicate how people were encountering whatever was causing them to vanish. The results showed a rough semicircle around Collins Valley, with most incidents occurring within a 15-mile radius of the community. "What's particularly interesting is what we're not seeing," Reeves said, pointing to blank areas on the map. "There are dozens of other remote communities and isolated properties in this region, but we're not getting missing persons reports from those areas. Whatever's happening seems to be concentrated specifically around Collins Valley." The geographical concentration couldn't be coincidental. Montana contained millions of acres of wilderness where people could disappear without explanation, yet 14 separate incidents had occurred in the immediate vicinity of a single small community. Either Collins Valley was experiencing an unprecedented run of bad luck, or something about the community was connected to the disappearances. Chen had spent the morning reviewing property records and legal documents related to Collins Valley, trying to understand the community's unusual relationship with government authority. The research revealed a complex history of disputed land claims, federal survey challenges, and legal precedents that had effectively created a zone of ambiguous jurisdiction. The Collins family's original homestead claim covered roughly 12,000 acres, Chen explained. But over the decades, they've maintained control over an area more than twice that size, claiming it under various 19th century mining and grazing rights that were never formally challenged or resolved. The legal ambiguity had practical consequences for any law enforcement investigation. Standard procedures for searching property, interviewing witnesses, or collecting evidence required clear jurisdiction and legal authority. In Collins Valley, both federal and state agents operated in a gray area where their authority could be challenged and their actions potentially invalidated by subsequent legal review. Samuel Collins wasn't making idle threats yesterday, Chen continued. His family has successfully challenged government authority in court 3 different times over the past 40 years. They have expensive lawyers and detailed documentation of their property claims. Any investigation that doesn't respect those claims could get tied up in litigation for years. The jurisdictional complications explained why previous investigations had been limited in scope and effectiveness. Local law enforcement agencies lacked resources for extended operations in remote areas, while federal agencies faced legal challenges to their authority. Collins Valley had effectively insulated itself from outside scrutiny through a combination of geographical isolation and legal barriers. Reeves understood that solving the missing persons cases would require a careful balance between investigative necessity and legal constraints. Federal agents couldn't simply search Collins Valley property without warrants based on specific evidence, but they also couldn't ignore the geographical concentration of disappearances around the community. "We need to establish whether the Collins family and their neighbors have information about these disappearances," Reeves said. "That means conducting formal interviews with Valley residents, examining any physical evidence in the area, and determining whether local knowledge could help explain what happened to these 14 people." The challenge was approaching Collins Valley residents in a way that would encourage cooperation rather than trigger the community's defensive response to outside authority. Chen's initial visit had established that Valley residents were aware of the federal investigation and prepared to present a united front against what they viewed as government intrusion. "I think our best approach is transparency," Chen suggested. "We tell them exactly what we're investigating and why we need their help. These are 14 families who deserve answers about what happened to their loved ones. Most reasonable people would want to help with that, even if they're suspicious of government authority." The strategy required faith that Collins Valley residents would prioritize humanitarian concerns over territorial protection, an assumption that wasn't necessarily warranted given the community's history of resistance to outside interference. But alternative approaches, surveillance, undercover operations, or aggressive investigation tactics, risked escalating the situation and potentially jeopardizing any evidence that might exist. Chen and Reeves spent the afternoon planning their next visit to Collins Valley, identifying key residents to interview and developing questions that might reveal information without triggering community defensiveness. They decided to focus initially on practical issues. Had anyone seen strangers in the area, noticed abandoned vehicles, or heard about visitors who might have encountered difficulties? The approach avoided direct accusations while establishing whether Valley residents had knowledge relevant to the investigation. If Collins Valley was simply an isolated community, that happened to be located near where people were disappearing, residents should be willing to share any information that might help explain the disappearances. As evening approached, Chen received a call that added new urgency to their investigation. The caller was Janet Morrison, dispatch supervisor for the Montana State Police, and her voice carried the strain of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Margaret, we've got another missing person report," Morrison said. "This one's different, though. The missing individual specifically told colleagues he was planning to visit Collins Valley." The latest case involved Dr. Andrew Chen, a cultural anthropologist from Montana State University, who'd been researching isolated American communities as part of a book project about cultural preservation in the modern era. Dr. Chen had informed his department that he planned to spend several days in Collins Valley, conducting interviews with residents about their community's history and traditions. Dr. Chen was supposed to return to campus 3 days ago, Morrison continued. His department chair says he's extremely reliable about keeping appointments and communication schedules. When he didn't show up for his Tuesday classes and wasn't answering his phone, they filed a missing person report. The timing of Dr. Chen's disappearance was significant. He'd traveled to Collins Valley after the federal investigation had begun, meaning his visit would have occurred while community residents were already aware of official interest in their area. If Dr. Chen had encountered trouble in the valley, it would be difficult to attribute his disappearance to coincidence or natural causes. "There's something else," Morrison added. "Dr. Chen's vehicle was found this afternoon in the parking area outside Collins Valley, but there's no sign he ever made it into the community itself. His camping gear is missing from the vehicle, but his research materials and identification were left behind." The discovery of Dr. Chen's abandoned vehicle followed the same pattern as previous disappearances, people arriving in the Collins Valley area, leaving their vehicles in staging areas, and then vanishing before completing their intended activities. The consistency of the pattern strongly suggested systematic rather than random causes. Reeves understood that Dr. Chen's disappearance represented both a crisis and an opportunity. Another missing person increased the urgency of their investigation and potentially exposed their operation to media attention and political pressure. But Dr. Chen's specific intention to visit Collins Valley provided clear justification for immediate and intensive investigation of the community. "We can't wait any longer to interview Valley residents," Reeves told Chen. 15 people missing, with the latest case directly connected to Collins Valley, gives us sufficient cause to treat this as a major criminal investigation rather than a missing persons inquiry. The shift in investigative status would allow federal agents to request additional resources, obtain search warrants if necessary, and apply pressure on local authorities to cooperate with their operation. It also meant that Collins Valley's legal challenges to government authority would be weighed against public safety concerns and the urgent need to determine what was happening to people who entered their territory. As Chen prepared for what would likely be a confrontational return to Collins Valley, she reflected on the community's confident resistance to outside authority. Samuel Collins and his family clearly believed they could control how any investigation proceeded, using legal challenges and geographical isolation to maintain their autonomy. They seemed genuinely convinced that their traditional way of life took precedence over government law and outside interference. But 15 missing people represented a level of crisis that even isolated communities couldn't simply ignore or deflect through legal maneuvers. Someone in Collins Valley knew something about these disappearances, whether they were direct witnesses, indirect participants, or simply residents who'd noticed unusual activities in their territory. Chen's job was to find those people and convince them that cooperation was both morally necessary and legally unavoidable. The investigation was about to enter a new phase, one where the careful balance between federal authority and local autonomy would be tested by the simple question of what had happened to 15 people who disappeared after traveling toward a remote Montana valley that seemed determined to keep its secrets hidden beneath the vast sky of the American West. The second federal visit to Collins Valley took place on a gray October morning when low clouds obscured the mountain peaks and cast the entire community in an atmosphere of foreboding. Agent Reeves arrived with a team of 4 federal investigators, while Trooper Chen coordinated with additional state police resources stationed at strategic points around the valley's perimeter. The expanded law enforcement presence wasn't intended as intimidation, but rather as a demonstration that the investigation had moved beyond preliminary inquiries into active criminal investigation territory. Samuel Collins was waiting on the porch of the general store when the federal convoy arrived, his posture and expression suggesting he'd been expecting this escalation since Chen's initial visit. Beside him stood three other men whose bearing and age suggested they were family patriarchs or community leaders, all dressed in work clothes that somehow conveyed both rural practicality and quiet prosperity. The message was clear. Collins Valley was prepared to meet federal authority with its own established hierarchy. "Agent Reeves," Samuel said as the federal team approached, "I assume this visit is about Dr. Chen's disappearance. We've been expecting someone would want to ask questions about that." The directness of Samuel's opening statement surprised Reeves, who'd prepared for deflection or denial rather than immediate acknowledgement of the latest missing person case. Either Samuel Collins was demonstrating transparency as a form of cooperation, or he was confident that his community had nothing to hide regarding Dr. Chen's disappearance. "We're investigating 15 missing persons cases, Mr. Collins," Reeves replied. "Dr. Chen's disappearance is the latest, but it's part of a larger pattern that we need to understand. We're hoping your community can help us determine what's happening to people who travel through this area." Samuel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Agent Reeves, our valley has existed peacefully for nearly 90 years because we understand the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. When people respect those boundaries, everyone gets along fine. When people don't respect them—" He let the statement hang in the mountain air, its implications unmistakable. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ruth Collins, who emerged from the general store carrying a folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone prepared for a difficult business transaction. Her presence shifted the dynamic from confrontational to procedural, as if the community had decided to treat the federal investigation as a legal matter, requiring careful documentation rather than a law enforcement crisis demanding immediate answers. "Agent Reeves, before we continue this conversation, I need to clarify some jurisdictional issues," Ruth said, opening her folder to reveal what appeared to be legal documents and survey maps. "Collins Valley operates under specific property rights and territorial agreements that predate current federal and state authority. Any investigation conducted here needs to respect those legal frameworks." Reeves had anticipated legal challenges to federal authority, but he hadn't expected them to be presented so formally and confidently. The Collins family clearly had extensive legal preparation for exactly this type of situation, suggesting they'd been planning their response to government investigation for years rather than improvising reactions to current events. "Mrs. Collins, we're investigating missing persons cases that may involve federal crimes," Reeves said. "While we respect property rights, public safety concerns take precedence over jurisdictional disputes. We need to determine what happened to 15 people who disappeared in this area." Ruth's expression remained professionally courteous, but her words carried the weight of legal certainty. "Agent Reeves, what you consider public safety concerns, we consider territorial violations. These missing people chose to enter an area where they understood the risks and accepted the consequences of their decisions. Collins Valley can't be held responsible for the poor judgment of outsiders who ignored clear boundaries." The exchange revealed the fundamental disagreement underlying the entire investigation. Federal agents viewed the missing persons cases as crimes requiring investigation and resolution, while Collins Valley residents apparently considered them the predictable results of outsiders violating territorial boundaries that the community had every right to enforce through its own methods. Reeves decided to shift tactics, focusing on specific information rather than abstract legal principles. "Mr. Collins, Dr. Andrew Chen specifically told colleagues he was planning to visit your community to conduct interviews about local history and traditions. Did he ever make contact with Valley residents?" Samuel Collins exchanged glances with the other men on the porch, a brief consultation that suggested the community had discussed their response to exactly this question. "Dr. Chen never reached our community, Agent Reeves. His vehicle was found outside our valley, which suggests he encountered difficulties before completing his intended visit. The answer was technically accurate, but incomplete, in ways that raised additional questions. If Dr. Chen hadn't reached Collins Valley, what had prevented him from completing the short journey from his abandoned vehicle to the community? And why had Valley residents been aware of his intended visit if he'd never made contact with them? "How did you know Dr. Chen was planning to conduct interviews?" Reeves asked. "If he never reached your community, how were you aware of his research interests?" Samuel's expression didn't change, but his response came after a pause that suggested careful consideration. "We keep track of people who express interest in visiting our valley, Agent Reeves. Dr. Chen had contacted the trading post several weeks ago, asking about arrangements for an extended visit. We told him that Collins Valley doesn't accommodate outside researchers." The revelation that Dr. Chen had been actively discouraged from visiting Collins Valley added new dimensions to his disappearance. If Valley residents had explicitly rejected his research proposal, why had he traveled to the area anyway? And what had happened to him after he'd apparently ignored their refusal to cooperate with his project? "Do you have records of this contact with Dr. Chen?" Reeves asked. "Phone calls, letters, any documentation of your conversation about his research plans?" Ruth Collins consulted her folder before responding. "We maintain careful records of all outside contact, Agent Reeves. Dr. Chen was informed that Collins Valley doesn't participate in academic research projects and that his visit would not be welcomed by community residents." The existence of detailed records suggested that Collins Valley's interaction with outsiders was systematic rather than casual, and that the community had established procedures for managing external interest in their affairs. This level of organization was unusual for isolated rural communities and implied deliberate planning for situations exactly like the current federal investigation. Agent Sarah Martinez, one of Reeves's team members, had been quietly documenting the conversation and observing community dynamics during the exchanges between federal agents and Collins family representatives. She noticed that other Valley residents were maintaining discreet observation of the official visit, positioning themselves around the community center where they could monitor events without directly participating in the confrontation. "Mr. Collins," Martinez interjected, "we've identified 15 separate missing persons cases in this area over the past 6 months. That's an extraordinary number for such a remote location. Has your community noticed any unusual activity that might help explain these disappearances?" Samuel Collins's response was immediate and confident. "Agent Martinez, Collins Valley maintains excellent security and communication within our territory. If there was unusual activity that posed risks to visitors, we would be the first to know about it. The fact that we haven't observed such activity suggests the problems these people encountered occurred outside our immediate area." The answer implied that Collins Valley had comprehensive surveillance capabilities and community coordination systems that would detect any significant events in their territory. If true, this meant Valley residents would necessarily know whether missing persons had encountered difficulties within the area they controlled, making their claims of ignorance about the disappearances increasingly implausible. "What kind of security and communication systems does your valley maintain?" Martinez asked, recognizing an opportunity to gather intelligence about community capabilities and organization. Ruth Collins closed her folder, signaling that the community had reached its limit for answering questions about internal operations. "Agent Martinez, Collins Valley's internal security arrangements are private matters that don't concern federal authorities. We maintain order and safety within our territory using methods that have proven effective for nearly 90 years. The refusal to discuss security arrangements was understandable from a community perspective, but problematic from an investigative standpoint. If Collins Valley had comprehensive security systems, they would necessarily have information about any incidents involving missing persons in their area. Their unwillingness to share such information suggested either active concealment or complicity in whatever was causing people to disappear. Reeves decided to apply more direct pressure, recognizing that diplomatic approaches weren't producing useful information. "Mr. Collins, we have 15 families who deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. If your community has information that could help these families get closure, withholding that information could be considered obstruction of a federal investigation. Samuel's expression hardened slightly, but his voice remained calm and controlled. Agent Reeves, Collins Valley has operated according to its own laws and traditions for nearly a century. We've maintained peace and order without outside assistance, and we've never asked government agencies to solve our problems. In return, we expect our autonomy to be respected by authorities who have no jurisdiction in our territory. The exchange had reached an impasse where federal agents were demanding information that Collins Valley residents were refusing to provide, each side citing legal authority that the other side didn't recognize. But the conversation had revealed important insights about community organization, planning, and attitudes that would inform the next phase of the investigation. We'll need to conduct interviews with individual Valley residents, Reeves informed Samuel. People who might have seen unusual activity, encountered strangers, or have information about any of the missing persons cases. This is a voluntary process, but we hope community members will cooperate. Samuel Collins' response was swift and decisive. Agent Reeves, Collins Valley residents don't participate in federal investigations without community approval and legal representation. Any interviews will need to be arranged through proper channels with advance notice and appropriate legal protections. The requirement for community approval of individual interviews suggested that Collins Valley operated more like a closed organization than a typical American community, where residents could freely choose their level of cooperation with law enforcement. This level of collective control over individual behavior was unusual and potentially problematic from a legal standpoint. As the federal team prepared to leave Collins Valley, Agent Martinez observed something that would prove significant in subsequent investigation planning. Several younger residents, people in their 20s and 30s, had been watching the official visit with expressions that seemed different from the unified resistance displayed by community leaders. These younger faces showed signs of uncertainty, conflict, or possibly sympathy for the missing persons' families. "Did you notice the younger residents?" Martinez asked Reeves as they drove away from the valley. "They didn't seem as committed to the community's resistance as their parents and grandparents. Some of them looked like they wanted to say something but didn't dare." The observation suggested potential fractures in Collins Valley's united front, generational differences that might create opportunities for federal agents to gather information from community members who weren't fully committed to protecting whatever secrets the valley was hiding. Younger residents might be more willing to cooperate with authorities, especially if they could be approached away from community oversight. Reeves spent the evening reviewing the day's conversations and planning the next phase of the investigation. Collins Valley's resistance to federal authority was sophisticated and well prepared, but it wasn't absolute. The community's legal challenges would take time to resolve, but 15 missing persons cases provided federal agents with significant justification for intensive investigation regardless of local objections. "We're going to establish continuous surveillance of valley access points," Reeves told his team during their evening briefing. "Monitor who comes and goes, document any unusual activity, and look for opportunities to approach valley residents when they're outside community territory." The surveillance operation would require careful coordination with state and local authorities, but it offered the best opportunity to gather intelligence about Collins Valley operations without directly confronting the community's legal resistance. Federal agents needed to understand what was really happening in the valley, whether residents were actively involved in the disappearances or simply witnesses who were being coerced into silence. As Chen drove back to her patrol area that night, she reflected on the day's revelations about Collins Valley's organization and attitudes. The community wasn't simply protecting its privacy or asserting property rights. They were operating according to a completely different moral and legal framework that placed community authority above individual rights and territorial control above government jurisdiction. 15 people had disappeared in the vicinity of Collins Valley, and community residents clearly knew more than they were revealing to federal investigators. Whether they were direct participants in whatever was causing the disappearances or simply witnesses who'd been intimidated into silence, their continued resistance to investigation suggested that the truth was darker and more complex than anyone had initially suspected. The investigation had moved beyond missing persons inquiry into something that resembled a standoff between competing systems of law and authority, with 15 missing lives hanging in the balance and a remote Montana community determined to preserve its secrets against all outside pressure. The next phase would test whether federal authority could penetrate the wall of silence that protected Collins Valley, from answering questions about what happened to people who'd made the fatal mistake of crossing boundaries that existed nowhere on any government map. The breakthrough in the Collins Valley investigation came from an unexpected source. A 26-year-old woman named Emily Collins, who worked as a nurse in Missoula and had grown up in the valley before leaving for college and never returning to live there permanently. Agent Martinez had identified Emily through public records as someone who might have divided loyalties between family tradition and professional ethics, particularly given her medical training and regular exposure to diverse perspectives outside the isolated community. Emily agreed to meet Martinez at a coffee shop in Missoula, 30 miles from Collins Valley, on a Tuesday morning when her hospital shift schedule provided several hours of free time. The meeting was arranged through careful intermediaries and conducted with guarantees of confidentiality. But Emily's willingness to even consider talking with federal agents represented the first crack in the Valley's unified resistance to outside investigation. "I need you to understand something before we start," Emily said, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that she hadn't touched since ordering. "I love my family and I respect our traditions, but I also took an oath to do no harm. And I can't ignore what's been happening in the Valley. I can't be part of covering up something that's destroying other families." Martinez had conducted hundreds of witness interviews during her FBI career, but she recognized this as a moment that could transform the entire investigation. Emily Collins wasn't just a potential source of information. She represented the conscience of a community that had been operating according to rules that conflicted with both legal standards and basic human decency. "Emily, we're investigating 15 missing persons cases," Martinez said gently. 15 families who don't know what happened to their loved ones. Anything you can tell us might help bring those families some peace, even if the truth is difficult. Emily's expression showed the internal conflict between family loyalty and moral obligation that had brought her to this meeting. "Agent Martinez, Collins Valley has rules that most people wouldn't understand. We believe in protecting our territory and our way of life, but some people interpret those beliefs in ways that go beyond what's right or legal." The admission that some Valley residents had acted inappropriately was significant, but Emily's careful phrasing suggested she was trying to provide information without directly accusing specific individuals of criminal behavior. Martinez recognized the delicate balance required to keep Emily talking while gathering actionable intelligence about what had happened to the missing persons. "Can you tell me about these rules?" Martinez asked. "How does the community decide when someone has violated territorial boundaries, and what happens to people who cross those lines?" Emily was quiet for several minutes, staring out the coffee shop window at the Montana landscape that extended toward the mountains containing her family's valley. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone revealing secrets she'd carried for years. "There's a council," she said finally. 12 men from the oldest families, led by my grandfather Samuel and his brothers. They meet when there are problems with outsiders, and they decide how to handle situations that threaten community security. Most of the time, it's just warnings or escorts to the valley boundary, but sometimes— She stopped speaking, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Martinez waited, understanding that pushing too hard might cause Emily to retreat back into family loyalty and community silence. "Sometimes what, Emily?" Martinez asked softly. "Sometimes they decide that certain threats require permanent solutions," Emily whispered. "They justify it by saying we're protecting generations of family heritage and defending our right to exist without outside interference. They believe they're guardians of something precious that would be destroyed if government authority was allowed to take control of our valley." The revelation that Collins Valley operated under a council system that made decisions about permanent solutions to outside threats provided the first direct evidence of organized community involvement in the missing persons cases. Emily's description suggested a deliberate process where community leaders evaluated strangers and determined their fate based on perceived threats to valley autonomy. Emily, do you have knowledge about specific cases? Martinez asked. Any of the 15 people we're investigating. Emily nodded slowly, her decision to cooperate apparently final despite the personal cost. Dr. Chen, the anthropologist, he contacted the trading post asking about documenting our community traditions. The council met and decided that academic research would bring unwanted attention from government agencies and threaten our legal position regarding property rights. The information confirmed federal suspicions about Dr. Chen's disappearance while raising additional questions about the council's decision-making process and methods. If Valley leaders had rejected Dr. Chen's research proposal, why hadn't they simply refused him access rather than allowing him to travel to the area where he subsequently disappeared? What happened to Dr. Chen after the council made their decision? Martinez asked. Emily's hands were shaking now, her internal conflict manifesting in physical symptoms as she prepared to reveal information that would implicate her own family in serious crimes. The council sent people to meet him at the valley entrance. They explained that his research wasn't welcome and that he needed to leave the area immediately. When he refused and insisted on his right to conduct academic research, they decided he represented a threat that couldn't be managed through warnings. The euphemistic language Emily used to describe Dr. Chen's fate was telling. Valley residents apparently had developed ways of discussing serious violence without explicitly acknowledging what they were describing, creating psychological distance from actions that most people would consider unacceptable, regardless of justification. Emily, I need you to be more specific, Martinez said. What exactly happened to Dr. Chen? The directness of the question forced Emily to confront the reality she'd been avoiding through careful word choices. They killed him, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. The council decided that Dr. Chen's research would eventually bring federal attention to the valley, which would threaten our independence and possibly result in government seizure of family property. They justified it as defending our community's survival. The confession provided federal agents with their first direct evidence of homicide in connection with the missing persons cases, but it also revealed the ideological framework that Valley leaders used to justify extreme violence against perceived threats. Emily's description suggested that Collins Valley operated according to a siege mentality where community survival required elimination of any outside influence that might compromise their autonomy. How many of the other missing persons cases involved similar council decisions? Martinez asked, recognizing that Dr. Chen's murder might be part of a much larger pattern of systematic elimination of perceived threats. Emily's response confirmed federal agents' worst fears about the scope of the investigation. All of them, she said. Everyone who disappeared in the past year was someone the council identified as a potential threat to community security. Researchers, journalists, government workers, even tourists who seemed too curious about valley operations or asked too many questions about local history. The systematic nature of the killings transformed the investigation from a missing persons inquiry into one of the largest serial murder cases in Montana history. 15 people had been systematically identified as threats and eliminated by a community council that believed it had the right to kill anyone who might compromise their territorial independence. Where are the bodies, Emily? Martinez asked gently. These families deserve to recover their loved ones and have proper closure. Emily's description of body disposal revealed the organized and premeditated nature of the valley's operations. There are old mining tunnels in the mountains above the valley, abandoned shafts that go down hundreds of feet. The council uses those locations because they're on family property, and nobody would ever find them without detailed knowledge of the mining history. The information about burial locations would be crucial for federal agents seeking to recover evidence and provide closure to victims' families, but it also demonstrated the long-term planning and local knowledge that valley leaders used to conceal their crimes. Using abandoned mining shafts suggested they'd been planning for systematic body disposal long before the recent pattern of disappearances began. Martinez spent another hour with Emily, gathering detailed information about council membership, decision-making procedures, and specific knowledge about individual missing persons cases. Emily's information painted a picture of a community that had gradually evolved from territorial defensiveness into systematic murder, with each killing making subsequent violence easier to justify and execute. "Emily, would you be willing to provide this information in official testimony?" Martinez asked. "Your cooperation could be essential for bringing justice in these cases and preventing future killings." Emily's agreement to testify represented enormous personal courage, since it would effectively make her a traitor to her own family and community. "I can't live with keeping this secret anymore," she said. 15 people are dead because my family and neighbors decided that protecting our way of life was more important than respecting other people's right to exist." The intelligence Emily provided allowed federal agents to develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing Collins Valley's criminal operations while protecting the witness whose testimony would be essential for successful prosecutions. The case had evolved from investigation to intervention, with federal agents now tasked with preventing future killings while gathering evidence about past crimes. Agent Reeves coordinated with FBI headquarters to request additional resources and specialized personnel for what would become one of the most complex law enforcement operations in Montana history. The geographic challenges of operating in remote mountain terrain, combined with the legal complications of Collins Valley's disputed jurisdiction, required careful planning and extensive support from multiple agencies. "We're dealing with an organized community that has systematically murdered at least 15 people over a 6-month period," Reeves explained during a briefing with FBI leadership. "They have detailed knowledge of local terrain, sophisticated legal challenges to federal authority, and apparent willingness to use violence against anyone they perceive as threatening their autonomy." The federal response involved coordinating with state and local law enforcement, obtaining comprehensive search warrants for Collins Valley property, and developing plans for safely apprehending community leaders while protecting potential victims and witnesses. The operation required treating Collins Valley as a hostile territory controlled by armed individuals with demonstrated willingness to kill perceived threats. Trooper Chen was assigned to coordinate state police support for the federal operation, a role that required balancing investigative needs with public safety concerns and legal requirements. Her familiarity with Collins Valley residents and territory made her knowledge essential for planning an operation that could safely resolve the situation without triggering additional violence. "The challenge isn't just apprehending suspects," Chen explained during operational planning sessions. "Collins Valley residents believe they're defending their constitutional rights and family heritage. They view federal intervention as an invasion that justifies violent resistance. We need to find ways to minimize confrontation while ensuring officer safety and preserving evidence." The operational complexity was increased by Collins Valley's geographical isolation and the community's extensive knowledge of local terrain. Federal agents would be operating in an area where residents had decades of familiarity with every trail, hiding place, and escape route, while law enforcement personnel were working in unfamiliar territory that could easily become dangerous if Valley residents chose to resist arrest. Emily Collins's testimony provided federal agents with detailed intelligence about community leadership, decision-making processes, and specific locations where evidence might be recovered. But her information also revealed the depth of community involvement in the killings, suggesting that successful prosecutions might require testimony from multiple Valley residents who would need to be convinced to cooperate despite family and community pressure. Emily estimates that at least 30 people in the Valley have direct knowledge of the killings, Martinez reported. Some participated in council meetings where decisions were made, others helped with logistics or disposal, and most residents know generally what's been happening even if they weren't directly involved. The widespread community knowledge of the crimes meant that federal agents were dealing with a conspiracy involving significant portions of Collins Valley's population rather than actions by a small group of extremists. This level of community complicity would complicate both investigation and prosecution, since many potential witnesses were also potential defendants, depending on their level of involvement. The federal operation began at dawn on November 3, 1979, with coordinated arrests of 12 men identified by Emily Collins as council members responsible for deciding the fate of visitors to Collins Valley. The arrests were conducted simultaneously to prevent communication between suspects and minimize opportunities for evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Samuel Collins was arrested at his home without resistance, but his expression as federal agents read him, his rights conveyed defiance rather than surprise. His first words were not a request for a lawyer, but a statement that federal authorities had no jurisdiction in Collins Valley and that his family would challenge any prosecution through every available legal avenue. "You people don't understand what you're destroying," Samuel told Agent Reeves as he was led to a federal vehicle. "Collins Valley has existed peacefully for 90 years because we've maintained proper boundaries and protected what's ours. Everything we've done has been in defense of our right to exist without government interference." The statement revealed the ideological framework that had allowed Valley residents to justify systematic murder. They genuinely believed that protecting their community autonomy superseded other people's right to life, and that federal law enforcement represented an illegitimate invasion of sovereign territory rather than appropriate response to criminal behavior. Ruth Collins was arrested at the general store, where federal agents also seized records that Emily had indicated contained documentation of community decisions and outside contacts. Ruth's response to arrest was more strategic than her husband's, immediately requesting legal representation and refusing to make any statements about Valley operations or missing persons cases. "My family will not cooperate with this federal persecution," Ruth announced as agents searched the store for evidence. "Collins Valley will defend our rights and our way of life through every legal means available, and we will prevail against this government overreach, just as we have for 90 years. The simultaneous searches of Collins Valley properties yielded extensive evidence of systematic planning for dealing with perceived threats, including detailed records of visitors to the area, assessments of various individuals' potential danger to community security, and documentation of council meetings, where decisions about specific cases were made and approved. Federal agents also discovered weapons caches, communication equipment, and maps marking locations throughout the region where visitors might be intercepted before reaching the main community area. The evidence painted a picture of a community that had prepared extensively for conflict with government authority, while systematically eliminating anyone who might trigger federal investigation. The search of abandoned mining shafts identified by Emily Collins confirmed the location of multiple bodies, providing physical evidence that would be essential for prosecuting community leaders and bringing closure to victims' families. The recovery operation required specialized equipment and personnel due to the dangerous nature of abandoned mining sites, but federal agents were able to confirm the presence of human remains that would be analyzed for identification and cause of death. "We've recovered evidence consistent with Emily Collins's testimony," Reeves reported to FBI headquarters. "Physical remains, documentary evidence of systematic planning, and weapons that could have been used in the commission of these crimes. We have sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution while continuing investigation of other potential cases." The arrest and investigation phase revealed additional information about Collins Valley's operations that extended beyond the 15 missing persons cases that had triggered the federal investigation. Community records suggested that systematic elimination of perceived threats had been occurring for years, with some cases possibly dating back decades to earlier confrontations with government authority and outside interference. The psychological impact on Valley residents varied significantly based on their level of involvement and awareness of community crimes. Older residents who had participated in council decisions or supported community leadership remained defiant and committed to legal challenges against federal authority. But younger residents, particularly those who had education or employment outside the valley, showed signs of shock and guilt about their community's actions. Emily Collins's decision to cooperate with federal authorities inspired several other valley residents to provide information about community operations, creating a cascade effect that allowed agents to develop comprehensive understanding of how systematic murder had become normalized within Collins Valley's moral framework. These additional witnesses provided corroboration for Emily's testimony while filling in details about specific cases and individual responsibilities. The legal proceedings that followed would test whether the American justice system could effectively address crimes committed by an entire community operating according to alternative moral and legal frameworks. Collins Valley residents had systematically murdered 15 people while genuinely believing they were protecting their constitutional rights and family heritage from government persecution. The case raised fundamental questions about individual responsibility within communities that promote collective action, the limits of cultural autonomy in diverse societies, and the mechanisms through which isolated groups can drift into systematic violence while maintaining their conviction that they are defending rather than attacking basic American values. For the families of the 15 victims, the investigation provided answers about what had happened to their loved ones, while opening new wounds about the casual manner in which their family members had been evaluated as threats and eliminated by people who believed they had the right to determine who could safely be allowed to exist within their territorial boundaries. The Collins Valley case became a landmark investigation that revealed how geographic isolation, legal ambiguity, and community solidarity could combine to create conditions where systematic murder could occur with widespread local support and justification. It demonstrated that even in modern America, communities could evolve their own moral and legal systems that placed group survival above individual rights, territorial control above government authority, and community preservation above human life itself. The investigation's resolution brought justice for 15 victims and their families, but it also destroyed a community that had existed for nearly 90 years and displaced hundreds of people whose only crime was being born into a culture that had gradually transformed territorial defensiveness into systematic murder. The case left lasting questions about the balance between cultural preservation and legal accountability, the responsibility of individuals for community actions, and the mechanisms through which isolation can transform ordinary people into participants in extraordinary crimes. As federal agents completed their investigation and families finally received answers about their missing loved ones, Collins Valley itself became a ghost town, its buildings standing empty beneath the Montana sky, as testimony to how quickly a community's protective instincts can evolve into something that destroys both outsiders and the people it was supposed to protect. The valley that had once represented 90 years of successful independence became a monument to the tragic consequences of believing that any community has the right to determine who deserves to live based on their perceived threat to local tradition and autonomy. Fiction disclaimer. The following narrative is a work of complete fiction. All names, characters, places, events, and incidents portrayed are products of imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, actual events, or real locations is purely coincidental. This story is not based on any real historical events or actual crimes,